Hello, everyone. My name is Cornelius Tittel. This is Carroll Dunham, and I'm happy to have a talk with you about your work and how we ended up with something like your current exhibition at Eva Presenhuber. It's been quite a long way and quite a ride, and I hope we can talk about that ride. Before we start, I have to torture you a bit because I earn my money with writing, and I have to say I respect you very much as a painter, but also as a writer, as an essayist. Your collection of essays into words is one of my favorite art books in the last years, and I just picked the introduction or the beginning of one essay you wrote about Elizabeth Murray, and I just thought that if you could read that to us in your voice, it could give us a very good introduction into the situation we will talk about afterwards. So please welcome Carroll Dunham. And
how much torture do you? How much should I read?
Oh, just I made a mark.
Okay. Painting in New York during the second half of the 1970s was a mess. The self-analytical, radically empty work of artists like Joe Baer, Robert Ryman, Bryce Marden, and Robert Mangold, which had been the main chance in the not yet fully played out arc of modernist painting, was proving generative primarily for those artists and a tight phalanx of sympathetic curators and critics, while its implications of closure made its absorption by a generation of enraptured younger artists quite problematic. The art schools and galleries were loaded with mannered attempts to thread some needle of original nuance among the dead ends implied by the older artists' positions, while the broader painterly discourse became increasingly cacophonous. Photorealism and the remnants of lyrical abstraction waned as pattern and decoration, new image, and bad painting waxed in a Darwinian struggle for philosophical market share. Less categorizable investigations into the implications of painting at the nexus of conceptual art and traditional materiality were being pursued along both abstract and representational lines, and an approach to abstraction was beginning to crystallize, typified by artists like Bill Jensen, Gary Stephan, and Stephen Mule, that seemed to be asking what non-objective painting might be if Clement Greenberg's rigorous proscriptions had never hijacked the conversation in American aesthetics. The juggernaut of modernism had already broken down and was being stripped for parts, although it would be a few years until the Big Bang of the early 80s, when these disparate pathways would assume coherence as precursors to the sensibility of a new wave of younger artists. That's my setup for talking about Elizabeth Murray.
So let's say, hello. Let's say we have 1977. I just picked this year because I was born that year. You were like 28 years old back then. It's pretty much the situation you're describing. So what were you actually doing as a young artist around that time in your studio, or how did you make your money?
I had a job, and I made my work as well as as much as I could around that structure. Because I had jobs that allowed me to pay my rent and not take them so seriously that they consumed my mind. And I was working on paintings that are, this drawing that's up here is fairly representative of the kind of thinking I was involved with, which I guess was a way to try to take all these things that had interested me when I first really threw myself into the art scene in New York and somehow allow them to merge with my own real personal interests and hope that they would turn into something that didn't look like something else I had seen.
But you have been working as an assistant to Dorothea Rauschenberg.
I had worked in her studio.
She's a little bit forgotten or overlooked right now, but she was a major figure back then, and really in the context that you were describing in this text you just read, like a very systemic, minimal, very process-orientated artist. So
it was I'm sorry.
Yeah. What was the importance of this, like getting to know an artist like this, seeing her work every day? Was it something that impressed you a lot, or was it something that you wanted to get away from?
Well, both. I mean, it began as, it was absolutely my school. You know, I didn't really go to proper art school. My friends and I read art forums, smoked pot, and went to art galleries. You know, that was our basic thing. And when I got to New York, I had no interest in staying in school, but I knew that I wanted to just be around artists. I wanted to see what that would feel like. And a teacher I had set me up with Dorothea, I guess what we would now call an internship, you know, basically free labor. And we got along very well, and she was important to me because she had such a strong point of view. She was close with, a bit younger, but close with Saul LeWitt. So Saul LeWitt's, who I believe it actually invented the term conceptual art, or it was invented for him. That way of thinking was her, you know, similar, very systemic, very rigorous, very influenced by philosophy, but also very attached to materiality, which made it different from another wing of conceptual art that was trying to get away from physical things. So the history of painting was always on Dorothea's mind, and she was quite knowledgeable about it. And that was the beginning of my realizing how working in the present, in the culture in which you find yourself, in order to go anywhere very deep, you also have to know a lot about where you came from. And the two things Dorothea taught me were the importance of art history and how to use a hammer and how to draw a level line on the wall, like a combination of, I guess, intellectual things and physical things.
But you said to me once that you were back then in your mind competing, let's say, with 5 living artists, or they were like the people you were looking at, 5 living artists and a few dead artists. So it was not that you had very much to do with artists your age, or were like kind of seeing yourself in a peer group.
No, I didn't. I only had a couple of other close friends. I mean, I knew younger artists, but my friends from school, I had one very close friend who came to New York around when I did, and he's an artist. But the artists I was really meeting were 10 years older than I was. People like Mel Bachner and Barry LeVay, who were very nice to me. They were very generous. But what happened, and I think what you're quoting me as having said, has to do with when I realized that I had to step away from these people and these influences and find a way to be myself. I realized that if I didn't find some way to narrow down my, I wouldn't even call it an investigation. That would flatter me. My activities. If I didn't find a way to narrow that down, it was just all too scattered. You know, the possibilities for art were too diverse for me to be able to really find a path if I didn't almost arbitrarily narrow things down. And I didn't know anyone my age who was making paintings. So I liked that idea. I liked the idea of those limits, and I loved the history of painting. So I decided I was going to make paintings, that was going to be my path. And there were only a handful of painters that, Dorothea was very interested in Robert Ryman and what Bryce Martin was doing at that time, Robert Mangold, Agnes Martin. It's a certain type of response to earlier New York painting and to minimalism. And so that's what I started out thinking was important, and I immediately realized that I had to find a way past that, or I would just be in a dead end.
But then the 80s start, and suddenly you must have realized that there were basically a lot of painters your age in New York City, and they suddenly had big exhibitions.
Yeah, it was weird.
In huge galleries and big prizes, and there was a lot of attention, and you were like basically the same age, and you were still figuring out what to do in this field.
Right.
And they were basically there, boom, like Julian Schnabel, David Selly, the Italian guys. And did it make you like nervous to see that there indeed is a whole generation of painters your age, and that they must have made their homework a little bit before you in a way?
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate description of the situation. And sure, I mean, I had to give up on the idea. I had been able to tell myself that there was something quite unique about my own pursuit of painting, and I felt like I had a lot of space to operate because I didn't see anyone else near me. And then these artists that Cornelius alludes to appeared almost as complete things. At least that's how they were being talked about. Yeah, and it was very disturbing, and the combination of insecurity and competition and my own perhaps criticisms about their conclusions about what painting could be. It was all very confusing, but it was also good for me because it sort of woke me up. It made me more ambitious for myself.
So we will basically from that time when you did this drawing until the next painting that I'm showing, there's not much known work of yours. It's like very little. You must have destroyed everything, or
I didn't make much. I didn't destroy anything. The weird thing is how little I made.
Okay. So we're going to look at a painting called First Pine, and that's from 1984. And well, as we can see, it's painted on wood, and which must have given you somehow a kind of structure already to. So how did you come up with these paintings?
Well, I was trying to, as I said, I was trying to find a way to take the things that I thought were important and allow them to merge with the things that I might have been more personally interested in. So the physicality of my paintings at that time, the fact that they were made on sheets of raw wood, the touch, the materiality is completely transparent. That was the influence of thinking about artists like Ryman and thinking about the whole discourse around process and material that had taken place slightly earlier. My own generational influences, which had to do with the culture of psychedelics, the culture of underground comics, my own personal disposition to really, like, it was sort of my secret passion was surrealist painting, which none of the older artists I knew seemed to care at all about. And these things were rattling around, and I started to use the wood because I didn't want to be so ordinary as to use canvas, and I didn't like stretchers and canvas and all that stuff. It felt too much like a received idea of painting for me. So I started painting on these boards, and I immediately realized that I could use the pictures if you want to call them pictures, in the wood grain as things that would give. It felt like, I mean, I've said this to you before. It felt like using one of these panels as someone had already done a bit of work on the painting for me, and the wood was something I could respond to, rather than just start blank and have to impose myself.
But there's another thing to these paintings. If we look at them now, And we know your new show, like also the last show at Barbara Gladstone, now the show at Eva Presenhuber, The Restless. And we look at this work and what a great painter of assholes you have become. I mean, I
thought you would stop torturing me after the beginning of this.
And this, if we look at this painting now, I mean, the knots in the wood, they must have started something with you. I don't know if this might be the starting of, because you once said that you like the idea that there's a polymorphous perversity drifting through your work. And this might be just an abstract painting, but already you get the impression that something is growing out of it, which could become a little bit weird.
I'm as a kind of smart remark, I've described my early work as abstraction with a hard-on. But that actually became literally true. Not here, but my interest in painting had totally to do with the history of abstraction in modernism. That's why I was so disturbed and critical of the art of many of my peers in the 80s when I started to see it, because other than my girlfriend being a photographer, I had no personal interest in photography or in any idea about representation or subject matter. I was trying to find a way to go beyond this emptying out that had happened in painting and to try to reclaim some of the things that I thought had been left behind by the rigor of post-minimal thinking. So I think the influences of science fiction, which I had read since I was a kid, as I mentioned earlier, psychedelics, the whole aesthetic around that, artists like R. Crumb, who I'd looked at a lot. I wasn't 100% conscious that I was trying to make an alloy out of all these things. But I think that in hindsight, that's what was happening. So when you refer to that painting, I knew there were ways to read those things that were very, biological or anatomical. And I would court that up to a point, but never let it go too far.
But if we look at a painting like this, or I don't know how to describe that, it might be it's a beautiful abstract painting, but it also looks like a placenta, like something is really growing out of this. There's like bodily openings. It's like, it's something that becomes clearer and clearer, that this abstraction is kind of a breeding ground for something else.
I think that's perfectly said. I mean, the breeding ground that's a very good way to talk about it. I was trying to understand what my territory was, and that to me meant trying to understand a repertoire of marks and gestures and ways of thinking about material that felt like mine, whatever that even means, and to let them talk back to me. To somehow from early on, I had this idea that my paintings, if I really committed myself and gave into it, that my paintings would show me what to do. And I still feel like that. I still feel as though my paintings are leading me along rather than the opposite. So
there was never a conscious decision to bring in like these sexual bodily elements, and then out of that there were like slowly characters like growing.
As I say, I was up to a point. I was courting. I was trying to come up to a certain line, and then I realized, when my work literally became abstraction with a hard-on, that the line was a myth that I had told myself in order to make it possible to do anything, but that there was a kind of profound disconnect in my work, and that these things this painting you're showing is from early mid-90s or something.
91, I guess.
91, okay. I think I made a group of paintings that were just based on that pink rectangular shape, very large paintings, these kind of tower-like shapes, and then I would just turn myself loose. And I've always done an enormous amount of drawing. It's sort of how I engage my thought process. So, stuff I had done in my drawing, I just did all over the painting. And the paintings were interesting to me, but they felt like they were on a threshold. And for some reason, it occurred to me that I could take little rectangles and turn them loose as these idiotic characters. And I found that idea so unsettlingly subversive. At the same time, it was very attractive to me. I just decided, if you really are doing what you say you're doing all the time, you have to just go there. And so from that point on, I was allowing there to be characters moving around in the paintings, things that had no real, they have no relationship to realism. I mean, that would be ridiculous. They're animated rectangles that traveled around in the space of my paintings and started to show me what was possible.
So if someone would come up to you back then when you showed these paintings and would say, oh, is this like a commentary? Is this a metaphor for, let's say, the dog-eat-dog New York art world? you would have just...
I would have really been embarrassed, and I would have turned them in a very different direction. I don't really like to think about my work as a metaphorical situation. I think I'm not against that, and there are other artists whose work I might even be interested in, that might be a useful tool to unpack their work. But I was just trying to figure out a way to make a painting that actually interested me. And I know that could justify a multitude of sins, and probably has, but that really was what I was thinking about. Like, I remember, I'd have the thought, like, that is so strange. Wow, what would that really be like as a painting? And I tend to like the work of painters who, when I see their painting as a kind of hypothesis about painting, rather than, a good painting. I like the idea that every painting is an hypothesis about what a painting could be. And that's probably around the time I was doing this is when I really got involved with that idea consciously.
So back then you started to introduce a character. You can already see it somehow there on the next painting. I guess it became like a signature kind of character for your work. And
it wouldn't leave me alone.
And I would call him Dickhead.
You wouldn't be the first, Cornelius.
And I was just wondering, you come up with a character like this, and at the same time you make like incredibly beautiful abstract art, and on top of that you have this character. And how was it possible that you managed to kind of focus on this guy for a decade? For 10 years you were like kind of not stopping to paint.
I kept trying to find a way to make a painting that this image was, or this structure, as I call it, was not part of, and I couldn't find it. And it kept being a thing that gave me ideas.
But you were already sober back then, because you told me in the beginning you were always stoned in the studio. That had nothing to do with... so that didn't make a difference for you, like stopping?
Everything just got stranger when I got straight. It was, it didn't change anything. Using drugs had to do with my inability to be it had all to do with my fear of being alone. It didn't have anything to do with generating images or generating visions. It was a self-medication, 100%. And but that really, have any hope of living a long and healthy life, that isn't really a workable plan. So I changed the way I was rolling my game, as we say, and it actually, I think it made my work much more vivid, actually, and it made my concerns much more apparent to me. So this character that emerged out of my work, obviously, and there's the truism that all art is self-portraiture. I don't deny that, but that isn't what I was really thinking about. I was trying to make a structure that was stable, that had what we would call formal properties and also subject-driven properties that would somehow work in friction with the formalism. I don't know how much of this was conscious, but certainly my intuition was that it would be a rich terrain and would be quite different from anything anyone else was working on, at least as far as I knew. And then I think I saw maybe a group of a dozen paintings when I started with it, and then it just kept going and going.
But you kind of pushed this subject matter into so many different formal directions. You made like black and white paintings. You made paintings which were like of this character, which were basically hard-edged geometric paintings, where you kind of
right.
where the suit of the guy was suddenly like just a geometric shape. You were zooming in. You were basically doing like beautiful abstract paintings, which were just like a zoom in into a detail of this character.
That's right. That's exactly how I thought about it. I felt like I had made I kept finishing series of paintings, which tends to be how I work, and then thinking, okay, now couldn't I please think of something else? And I couldn't. But I felt like if I trusted my, this is worrying about this character was me getting hung up on the level of subject matter, which is something that I never intended to do as a painter. And when I stepped back from it and realized, just calm down, the subject is over there, take it as a given, and see what happens if you just work with it. And so that resulted in just exactly what you describe, a kind of a surprisingly wide range of approaches to this exact same subject.
I mean, this must have been at the same time liberating in a way, but also like totally neurotic. I mean, you couldn't.
I think that's a fair description. I felt free and a little bit crazy, and also a little bit frightened that there would never be anything else.
But also, in a way, if we think of where you were coming from and where you wanted to get away from, working with Dorothea Rauschenberg, like thinking about Sol-Lewis all day. I mean, in the way that this is like crazy and trippy and out of this world, it's also like a very systemic, very anal
completely
approach to.
Right. Well, I know myself now well enough to know that I have a very conservative side to my personality, and I also have whatever the opposite of that is, and they're in a kind of tension. And that my work comes out of that tension, and I have to know that. So, and I think it's still true of my work. To me, it's self-evident that, on the level of subject matter, it is what it is, and on the level of materiality and structure, it's something not different, but something parallel and they both have to happen. So that period of my work actually was, in hindsight, incredibly important for me, because I think I was able to allow things that when I was younger, you're young, you need to think you know what's good, and then you have to kill off your parents, and you have to, it's a whole Oedipal process of becoming yourself. And by this time, I was a bit older. I'd gotten married. I had children. I was in such a different place in my life, and I think I knew that this idea of systems didn't have to be as dry and cold as it had been taught to me, or as I had thought it was when I was younger. That it actually could be, that it could support a kind of investigation that I had never really understood before. So, you refer to Dorothea's work. I mean, when I was working in her studio, she was making all these drawings that were based on folding sheets of paper and then tracing the edges. So the structures the resulting structure was a combination of pencil lines and folds that was X's, triangles, things like that. I started to make these drawings of men in suits in this extremely reduced geometry, and I started to realize, oh my God, these are exactly the same shapes, but they are functioning in a completely different way. That was a huge realization, and it freed me to. I mean, I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing now if I hadn't realized that, because it's all still the same thing. It's basically a geometrical construction that becomes a subject.
So I want to show a painting now, which is kind of it's towards the end, let's say, of your dickhead phase. And it's a painting that my friend Michael Williams, the great artist, refers to as probably the best American painting in the last 50 years. So I just want to talk to you about this painting, which is just a killer masterpiece. It's called Square Mule. And what the hell were you thinking when you painted this painting?
Isn't it obvious? No, one of the ways that I felt I could it's about
the size.
1.5 meters on each side, something like that. Not that big, not tiny, not huge. And there is physical material all over the surface that's sort of crumpled up sheets of brown paper that were soaked in medium and stuck on the surface of the painting. A kind of literalization of the filthy subject. I wanted to see what would happen if I really confused this, this character you were asking me about, this male, this collection of male archetypes that was stuck together to create this character. I never engaged the idea of a complete physical body. I did one small group of paintings where I tried to imagine it as though it were actually a human body with legs and things, but I didn't really get into that too much at that time. But I thought, well, if you went outside of the implication was that this thing continued. If you imagined what was outside the edge of the painting, it could be anything. And I thought it would be really interesting to do a very simplified idea of female genitals and the bottom of a woman's body and stick it onto the given of this profile I've been working with. So I made a series of paintings. I called these images mules because of the idea of different species mating or different.
This one is called Giant Mule, and it's like 2.50 meters high.
Yeah, it's a very big painting. And as far as the gun, guns had been moving in and out of my work for a time. When all those little characters were in the paintings, I would sometimes draw them with weapons. Again, it was this idea of attributes, like human gender attributes, tools that were used to violent ends, very cartoonish ideas about representing those things.
I have to say it's a little bit cut on top and on the back. Here I see it perfectly.
Oh yeah, I'm listening.
The version is like, it's like...
Right. Yeah, the actual painting is probably twice as big. I mean, it's as high as that wall, maybe. It's very big. But the gun was in my work, and somehow when one was drawing this and had, I honestly don't know where the idea came from of representing it as the character sticking the gun up his own rear end. It just came into my head. I made a few little drawings. I figured out how I could do that, and I just thought, man, you got to do that. So I made the painting. And after I'd made it, I was, I think, simultaneously quite pleased with myself and quite unsettled.
Looking at this painting, I had to think of Malcolm Morley, who said something like the history of progression in painting is like basically you always have to look at the edges of paintings and zoom in to the edges,
yeah,
and then you have the next phase in contemporary painting. This was like he saw it like from Impressionism.
That's an amazing observation, because I had never heard that before. You told me that.
And if we zoom in here in the left-hand corner, and that's basically your last, I mean, you can't see the dickhead anymore, but let's say it's the last of these paintings, and you and there was an escape. There was like some paradise garden where you these...
And it's amazing to me to think about it now, because
it's the next painting we have still has a heart on in a way, but it's a tree. So it's you finally got rid of the character.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I knew when I was making that group of paintings called Mules that I actually saw the end of that character right there, literally, and I wasn't sure what was going to come next, but I knew it would be something different, and I found it in the work, which is what seems to always happen. So in the corner of that painting, in the far distance, these little trees which had been moving around in the work. Completely stupid idea about drawing a tree, the way, like the way a kid would probably. But I thought it might be something I could use as an armature to make paintings. And I started out not really understanding what would happen, but just sort of trusting it. I wanted my work to move back toward abstraction. I didn't want any more dialogue with human bodies and human sexuality and gender and any of that. I was really sick of it. And I thought that a tree was such a neutral, if not actually idiotic, premise for someone like me to make paintings about, that maybe it's one of the, that's such a bad idea, it might actually work. It was that kind of feeling.
But you failed miserably.
Yes, I did. I failed utterly. I made a lot of paintings, which I think of as paintings of trees, and I'm still very involved with that as a subject. But after, I don't know, I'm certainly no more than 2 years, maybe less, I can't remember, I started to have these annoying thoughts and things pop into my head, like, what if you actually really tried to draw a human being? Like, what about a naked woman next to a tree? That sort of thing. And it was very hard to imagine how a person with my skill set and my interests could make something that was undeniably what we would call figurative painting, and also have it be true to my ideas about painting. And it started out almost as not a dare, that's the wrong connotation, but as a kind of challenge to myself to see what that would even mean. And I was still working on the trees kind of in parallel. And I had a residency in Rome for 3 months. I was living there, and I gave myself an assignment to try to convince myself that this terrible idea was actually as terrible as I thought it was. And the opposite happened. I made a lot of drawings, and I also looked at a lot of painting in Rome, which, of course, it's naked human flesh everywhere. And I realized I have to do it. I have to do it. So when I came home, I started really trying to figure out how that would work, and it's pretty much the path I've been on since, I guess.
There's a really nice documentary, like a film, where I think you can't find it online, but you can, like really old school, you can order a DVD. And
of Roberta Smith and me.
Yeah,
Michael Blackwood, who's a really interesting...
It's basically Roberta Smith visiting you in your studio exactly around that time.
It was these paintings, which were actually an exhibition here in Zurich.
And there's some comic element to like seeing Roberta Smith wandering around the studio, looking at one vagina after another, and like going,
and
wow.
talking about it as though she's looking at, Malevich paintings or something.
Yes, exactly. It's really funny. And then
that's Roberta.
And then she says something like, "Oh, I think they have to be about strong women." And your answer is like, "Yeah, maybe that's pretty much the situation of my life with your wife, your daughters." But then again, you didn't seem convinced at all. It was more like you had to say something to this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I live my life surrounded by very strong women, and I have a lot of women in my life outside of my family. I mean, I in my work and all kinds of places. So I can't, and Roberta and I are very close friends. She knows my life very well. And we were in the studio just with Michael Blackwood, who was I guess nominally the director. I mean, he's made a lot of movies about artists with a couple of his tech people. It was very relaxed. But Roberta's a very close friend of mine. She's kind of reflecting back at me something which she kind of knows to be true. And I am trying to get more relaxed about these connections between my so-called real life and my paintings. I've never really understood that Rauschenberg remark about the gap between art and life. That seems to me like a sort of false construction that sounds profound, but I don't really understand it. But in my own case, if I really look back over the history of my work, changes in my work, which I experienced as my work trying to take me to a new place, do correspond to rather significant changes in my real life. Getting married, having child number 1, having child number 2, realizing that I need to have a studio in the country in order to focus the way I need to. These are kind of significant changes in the way your life is being led, and each one of them does correspond with a shift in my work. It's annoying to realize that because it doesn't go with my model of of the kind of artist I tell myself I am. But
also if you tell yourself or your audience in an interview, or like with Roberta Smith, that these paintings you were doing back then, and we are looking at one, that they are mostly like, for you, they're just solutions for formal problems. Like there was no, like subject matter does not matter, and you're standing in a room full of these paintings, and it's also not completely convincing.
No, I'm afraid I have to agree. Solutions to formal problems don't get the reaction from people that paintings like that get. So, I had an exhibition of these paintings at Pressenhuber Gallery here in Zurich, where my present show is, and I was very proud of that group of paintings. I felt 100% convinced that they were the right paintings for me to have made. I had never had a doubt about it. But to be alone in your studio with these things and telling yourself, well, move the leg this much and, make the color blue a little different. I mean, that sort of stuff is very different from putting these things out in the world, and all anyone wants to talk about is, what is this guy's issue with women? Or, I would give talks at art schools and somebody would go, why isn't your work pornography? Suddenly I was in that conversation.
Oh, you said something really nice. I remember someone asked you about pornography, and then you said, if you really find someone jerking off to my paintings, I want to meet that person. So that's...
Yeah. Yeah, that's what...
So much about pornography, I
exactly.
would say. Yeah.
Exactly. Case closed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how much my work has to do with pornography. That isn't what it is. It may be crap. I have no idea, but it certainly doesn't have anything to do with pornography.
I love these paintings, self-examination paintings. I'm not sure if every collector out there is like crazy about them. I think they're amazing. So what was the reason after all these years being surrounded with the female nude in your studio to get into this subject and then have these restless here coming into focus?
I knew when I was working on, I call that whole group of paintings bathers. That was how that's how I kind of bracketed the project. And the fact I had done some writing about, I'd written an essay about late Renoir and a couple of other artists who had worked a lot, 100 years earlier with the subject of female bathers. And I always found it a very beautiful premise for painting. So I knew when I was working on this series that maleness had to come back. It just didn't seem possible that it had to be balanced somehow. I am a product of my times, and my idea about various gender roles and things are very influenced by feminism. And as we've commented earlier, I'm surrounded by women who embody feminist ideas. So I thought I have to put more of myself back in there. It's too much like that whole bullshit about the male gaze and things.
Like more self-examination.
Thank you. That came to me as a title after I had made the paintings, but that's for sure what led me to the paintings. So I have to, and the beginning of my trying to put male human bodies into my work was this notion of, the way a smart-ass kid would doodle on their desk or something, like looking down at yourself. I remember doing these drawings when I was a kid of some little sort of, like you look down at yourself and you draw the genitals and a couple of little things, and then, oh my God, it's this. So I started with that notion. I had a really interesting studio visit with a gentleman from Germany who came, and he happened to be gay, and he came to my studio and he saw all these drawings spread out here, and I had gone from trying to draw images of a man just looking down at his own body lying down. Then I got this idea of turning it into something more like stretching or a yoga position, and I liked the formal qualities of it. It felt like I was building a sort of totem image. And this guy looked at the drawings and he said, wow, every gay man knows what that is because they've all tried to blow themselves. And I thought, wow, okay. I don't ever remember that, but, I'll take that. So it was so clear to him, and he was so great with it. And it gave me a lot of confidence about these images, actually, which might sound weird. I probably should have ripped them up after he left, but that isn't what I did. So I took the drawings and I turned them into this group of paintings, and the bird came as a sort of visitation because the top of the painting was empty. I had to put something there.
Is it also a nod to Bernard Buffay?
You know, it's funny you say that because, of course, Bernard Buffay is the poster boy of too much, too soon, and crash and burn and all of that. He certainly had a nice...
But the crows are great, the crows that he painted.
But yeah, no, there has been a reassessment in certain circles of Bernard Buffay, and I the Venus over Manhattan in New York did an exhibition of him a while back, and I have no idea if there's actual, a kind of resurgent market in Buffay. I would have no way of knowing that, but there is something there. I mean, it's horribly repetitive and ultimately rather vapid to me, but there is absolutely something there at the core of it. He also painted people with guns and a lot of things that are of interest to me.
But if we think back to the very first painting that I shot, it was a drawing, like this very early stuff, and your young self, like being 28 years old or 30 years old, working for Dorothea Rauschenberg or whatever, like would see these paintings that you are doing today. What do you think?
I can't even imagine what my young self would make of any of this, you know? It's a strange thing because you go along in your life and you just follow. I mean, that's been my experience. As I keep saying, I'm following my work. It doesn't feel like making abrupt changes or changing your value system or betraying your earlier beliefs or any of that. Quite the opposite. It just feels like going deeper into the same tunnel. But if I could imagine a person with my attitudes as a young person, as a young man, I would have thought this work was idiotic, I'm sure. It may well be. It might still be idiotic, but it's an example of how thinking you know things is usually a mistake.
But actually, if you look at the bodies, you have not moved that far from where you started. I mean, there's still the same doodling going on. Some stuff that Twombly would have approved, I guess. I mean, he would love the kind of stuff you're doing on these bodies.
Well, Twombly was an enormous influence on not only me. I mean, many people of my generation who wanted to make paintings. He seemed like one person who showed a way forward. Since I have no, this is something I always am trying to explain to people. I don't have any facility at drawing the figure. When I was younger and I was supposed to go to figure drawing class, I would do anything I could possibly do to get out of it. I was terrible at it. I thought it was stupid. And I found it utterly retrograde. So when it came to me as an idea, as something that had meaning for me that I needed to pursue, I had to figure out how to do it really from the most basic beginning. And it didn't have to do really with observation. It had to do with, I mean, I can talk about looking down at my own body, but that's just a way to talk. That isn't what I was doing. I was drawing lines and shapes on pieces of paper in my notebook until it coalesced into something that I found believable. That's really how I approach my work now. I mean, it's sweet because a lot of like young guys that work at galleries, they always say, "You really interested in wrestling? Like, do you really understand wrestling?" I used to watch professional wrestling on TV. These ridiculous theatrical performances, but no, I don't know anything about wrestling. I start by drawing something that might be a foot or a hand or something, and then I just build them. And it's very much the same process as when I was making my paintings on wood. And I almost feel that, back then I had patterns in the wood to respond to. Now I have more of an inner template, a mental not even a clear picture, it's almost like a set of words in my head. White men wrestling, and then there's a list. They have 4 hands, 4 feet, 2 sets of genitals, 2 heads, like that. And I have to find a way for all that to fit into a rectangle and be both plausible and stable as a painting. And that's how they happen. But it's all the same shapes that I've always worked with. It's all the same. I think that's why I'm always surprised that more people don't ask me about the black outline. It's like they just accept it as the way you draw people, but this isn't the way you draw people. It's the way I draw people because this is what's evolved in my work. But it's all the same geometries and sets of marks and moves in terms of drawing. It's all the stuff that's been there basically from the beginning.
This painting here, I had the pleasure to see it. Like, I was very surprised. I was in Chicago some time ago and went into the Art Institute of Chicago, maybe my favorite museum in the world, and turned around the corner and saw a room with this painting and 2 other paintings from the same series. It was basically a Carroll Dunham room with these wrestlers and a late Philip Guston on top.
Yeah,
not on top.
It's quite an amazing thing for me.
And then I learned that basically these 3 paintings were a gift by Richard Prince to the Art Institute of Chicago. So I had to ask you about that. So how does a thing like this happen, that Richard Prince gives 3 of these works? Like, were you close friends? Did you?
Well, you'd be better off asking Richard.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's here.
So he basically bought these paintings and just gave them to a museum.
Yes, as a gift. It was an amazing gesture. I've never could have imagined it, and it was an amazing gesture. I mean, gesture trivializes it. It was an amazing thing for him to do. The museum was very happy to have the paintings, which was great, obviously. And I'm with you. I adore that museum. So all in all, it was a pretty special thing for me. Richard and I aren't close friends. We've known each other for a long time, and I think we have, I guess it's obvious at this point, we have quite a bit of mutual respect, but this wasn't a personal favor. It wasn't anything like that. He was, I think, he has apparently the means and had the desire to do something like that. And I think I don't know of a lot of artists who have success at his level who think like that. I was extremely impressed, actually.
So back when you started in the late 70s and early 80s, you basically said you had no peer group, not many artists of your generation you were close to, and now there's Richard Prince giving paintings to a museum.
Richard and I knew each other then because we actually both worked at Time magazine.
Okay.
And his then girlfriend and my girlfriend, who is now my wife, were very good friends. So I knew Richard early on, and we had a kind of dialogue. His ideas about appropriation and photography were very different from my ideas about painting, but it was really cool to realize that we could have a dialogue. But we haven't stayed in touch, and we don't see each other a lot. It isn't to say, it's overstating it to say that I didn't have a peer group. It's more that my world had to become very small in order for me to find my way into my work in a really.
But still, you have never been obviously, what we are looking at demonstrates quite clearly that you have never been part of any school, of any group. You were never kind of group with other people from your generation.
No.
You're also you like to write about outsider artists when you write essays. So somehow you managed, even though you were showing with Gladstone and Presenhuber and had major shows in New York City, you kind of managed to stay like an outsider. So my last question, after this thing with Richard Prince, is you are now planning or working on 2 museum shows. you're doing together with Albert Oehlen. He's basically nearly the same age as yours.
Mm-hmm.
I had no, like, you had no big contact over the years. It's not someone. Also, again, you were not like grouped with him.
No.
People saying, "Oh yeah, it's."
I mean, Albert and I have known each other for about 10 years, but not well at all. We, would bump into each other sometimes, and I started to look at Albert's work because back in the day we both showed our drawings at the same gallery in New York, David Nolan Gallery, and David was talking to me a lot about Albert and talking to Albert a lot about me, but Albert and I were not talking to each other. But I mean, I really like Albert's work. I mean, that goes without saying. I'm fascinated by it, and I've been following it as closely as I could for a long time. So I think of him, and the more I get to know him, the more I realize we actually share many attitudes, but I would have had no way of really knowing that. I never felt embraced by the German art scene, when I was younger. I mean, I had an exhibition at Jablonka Gallery in Cologne, and around 1990 or something, and I never really felt like the painters in Germany and Cologne that were my generation.
Yeah, but that was the time of Kippenberg and all his friends, and maybe the problem was just that you were already sober, and it just didn't work out.
That didn't help, I can tell you. Yeah. That didn't help. And I knew Kippenberger slightly because he was showing in New York at the same gallery that my wife was showing in. So I would see him, and there could no chance of any real conversation because I was sober and he wasn't. So, but life is long, and I really like these exhibitions that Albert and I are going to do together. It's exciting to me because I haven't really, as you say, I mean, I have a community. My wife is an artist. We have a circle of friends. I'm part of a network. I feel very connected to things, but as far as a peer group making painting that I could feel, like we're in the trenches together. I never have had that feeling, really. I've always felt like I was off on my own thing.
It seems to be coming together in the end, somehow.
Well, one hopes. I don't know.
So thank you for this amazing show. Thank you for this new favorite painting of mine. This is like amazing. Who everyone should see the show at Presenober, who hasn't had the chance to see it yet. And I think there's even a table with a new book, with a new catalog here. So, well, I don't want to torture you anymore. It's hot in here. And thank you, Carroll Dunham, for this conversation.
Yeah.